How many of you weren't able to make it last week? All right, if you weren't able to make it last week, I want to encourage you to watch the message on our website. Because last week I laid what I consider to be the necessary foundation for studying the book of Amos. But it wasn't just for the book of Amos. What I covered lays the necessary foundation for all of the prophetical books. So if you weren't here, I want to encourage you to go back and watch that sermon and print out the charts from the links we provided on our website. Those charts will prove to be very useful in studying the writings of the prophets if you really know how to use them. And you have to watch the sermon to know the value of those charts. Now, as I said last week, the prophetical books are the most difficult to understand of all the books in the Bible. And the main reason they're so difficult to understand is because the majority of the prophecies and messages of the prophets weren't written within a narrative. In other words, they weren't written within a story. So we don't know the context in which those messages or those prophecies were given. And that's a huge problem for us. Because if we don't know the context in which a prophecy or a message was given, then determining the meaning can be very difficult, if not impossible. So what are we supposed to do? Well, the first thing that we have to do is determine when the book we're studying was written and who it was written to. Now, once we've determined the date as precisely and accurately as possible and who it was written to, then we study that specific period of time. The history, the culture, the language, etc. We want to know what was happening at that specific time and in that specific geographical area with that specific nation or people. We also want to know anything else that might help us to understand the situation or circumstances that prompted God to send a prophet to that nation or to that person. In fact, that's what scholars are referring to when they talk about studying the historical cultural context. Now, once we understand or know the historical cultural context of a book, it's easy to understand the prophecies and the messages within that book, because we now know who the prophet was sent to and why God sent them to that specific nation or that specific person. We also know what the situation or the circumstances were that needed to be addressed through the prophecies or the message. Plus, we know exactly when it all took place. So we're able to place each prophecy within the proper context, which enables us to understand that prophecy. In other words, we're able to build the narrative from the historical cultural context, which makes all the difference in the world. Because now it's as if we have a story in which these prophecies are woven into, making them easier to understand. So basically what I'm telling you is that Amos is really not that difficult to understand, as long as you know the historical cultural context in which it was written. And I do. And I'm going to be sharing that with you as we go through the book of Amos. But first, let me give you a quick lesson on how the kingdom of Israel split into two kingdoms. The northern kingdom, which kept the name Israel, and the southern kingdom, which began using the name or became known as Judah. And then I'm going to zero in on Israel during the middle of Jeroboam II's reign, because that's when Amos prophesied, and that's who he was prophesying to, the northern kingdom, the nation of Israel. So as I told you last week, Solomon died sometime around 930 BC. Now, some scholars believe that he died in 931 BC. Some believe that he died in 922 BC. I happen to believe that he died in 930 BC, but I'm not going to tell you I know for sure that he did. So I'm going to say that he died sometime around 930 BC. But before Solomon died, God spoke to him and told him that his kingdom would be rent in two after his death. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 9 through 13, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. The Lord was very angry with Solomon, for his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. He had warned Solomon specifically about worshiping other gods, but Solomon did not listen to the Lord's command. So now the Lord said to him, since you have not kept my covenant and have disobeyed my decrees, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your servants. But for the sake of your father David, I will not do this while you are still alive. I will take the kingdom away from your son. And even so, I will not take away the entire kingdom. I will let him be king of one tribe for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, my chosen city. That's really interesting, because what it's telling us is that because of Solomon's sin of worshiping other gods, God told Solomon that he was going to tear the kingdom from him, that it would be split in two. Now, about the same time that God told Solomon this, he also sent a prophet to a man by the name of Jeroboam. And this prophet told Jeroboam that when Solomon died, he would be the king of Israel. But he also told him that he wouldn't rule over all 12 tribes. He would only rule over 10 of the tribes, because God was leaving one tribe for Solomon's descendants to rule over, for David's sake. Look at 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 29 through 40, and let's read this before you decide that I can't count. All right? How many tribes were there? 12 tribes. But he tells Jeroboam that he's going to rule over 10 tribes, and then he says he's going to save one tribe for Solomon's son, right? That's 11 tribes. So before you decide that I can't count, let's read this. One day, as Jeroboam was leaving Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah from Shiloh met him along the way. Ahijah, he's the prophet, was wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone in the field, and Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Jeroboam, take 10 of these pieces, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I'm about to tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon, and I will give 10 of the tribes to you. But I will leave him, how many? One tribe, for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. For Solomon has abandoned me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of Moab, and Moloch, the god of the Ammonites. Now I want you to see this. The reason he's doing this is because Solomon was worshiping other gods. Yes, he was wise, but if you remember, as we've been teaching on Sunday mornings, Solomon actually had this quest where he was searching for the meaning of life. And he started out with desiring pleasure. And he thought maybe pleasure is the secret to what life is all about. And so what he did is he took many wives, many concubines, and it's his wives that led him astray. So he started worshiping other gods and actually took him away from God. I told you later on in his old life, in his old age, he returned to God. He repented. But during this time, he started worshiping other gods. For this reason, he was going to lose the kingdom, but not in his lifetime. His son was going to. So he tells him, this is why. Now let's keep reading. He has not followed my ways and done what is pleasing in my sight. He has not obeyed my decrees and regulations as David his father did. But I will not take the entire kingdom from Solomon at this time. For the sake of my servant David, the one whom I chose and who obeyed my commands and decrees, I will keep Solomon as leader for the rest of his life. But I will take the kingdom away from his son and give 10 of the tribes to you. His son will have how many tribes? 1 tribe, so the descendants of David, my servant, will continue to reign, shining like a lamp in Jerusalem, the city I have chosen to be a place for my name. And I will place you on the throne of Israel, and you will rule over all that your heart desires. If you listen to what I tell you and follow my ways and do whatever I consider to be right, and if you obey my decrees and commands as my servant David did, then I will always be with you. I will establish an enduring dynasty for you as I did for David, and I will give Israel to you. Because of Solomon's sin, I will punish the descendants of David, though not forever. Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, not because Jeroboam did anything wrong, but because he finally heard about this prophecy. And when he heard about this prophecy, he thought he could thwart God's plan. So what he did is he tried to kill Jeroboam. But it says he fled to King Shishak of Egypt and stayed there until Solomon died. Now, before I talk any more about this, why was there only 11 tribes that were divided? Does anyone know? Well, first of all, let me explain something about the tribes, because most people get things confused. When they start counting up the tribes, they come up with the number 13. And the reason they do is because Joseph had 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. But what most people don't know, unless they've gone through my book study on the book of Genesis, then they know that there is not a tribe of Joseph, even though Joseph was one of the sons of Jacob. Joseph received the birthright, which meant that he got a double portion. So in his double portion, rather than it going to him, it actually went to his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Ephraim, of course, received the birthright. That's why it became the dominant tribe. But now when you count the tribes, you don't count the tribe of Joseph, you count Manasseh and Ephraim, but you come up with the number 13 because you have the tribe of what? Levi. So there's actually 12 sons, take away 1, and you have 11. Then you take the 2 from Joseph, because you took away his 1, you have 13. So how do you come up with 12 tribes? Well, the tribe of Levi was not counted because it didn't receive an inheritance of land. The Lord was its inheritance. The tribe of Levi was supposed to minister in the temple. And as a result of that, they did not get an allotment of land. They were able to live inside the cities, but where they received their income was not from the land, but from serving the Lord. So you didn't count them. So now when we come to this, you have those that say, well, wait a minute. Even if you count that up and you take away the tribe of Levi, then you come in and you say, well, you still just had 12, and now they're going to divide it 11 ways. So what's the deal? Well, here's the deal. If you remember, because of what Simeon did, he didn't receive his own land with its own borders, but he was actually dispersed among the tribe of Judah. So Simeon's tribal allotment of land was actually inside Judah. So Judah absorbed them. So they're not counted. That's why you have the 10 tribes of Israel and you have Judah. Simeon was a part of them, but it was absorbed by Judah. And if you don't know that, you start thinking, now wait a minute, 11 tribes, what happened with the 12? But anyways, I just wanted to give you that. How many of you cared about that? Nope, not really? All right, just wanted to make sure. Now, in what we just read, God specifically told Jeroboam that when he became king, that he was supposed to keep all of his commandments like David did. And if he did that, then he would establish him as a lasting dynasty. In other words, his family would always rule over the 10 northern tribes. Look back at verse number 38, and you'll see what I'm talking about. This is what he told Jeroboam. If you listen to what I tell you and follow my ways and do whatever I consider to be right, and if you obey my decrees and commands, as my servant David did, then I will always be with you. I will establish an enduring dynasty for you as I did for David, and I will give Israel to you. You see, God made a promise to David. He made a promise that he would have a dynasty. And Jesus, the Messiah, will sit on David's throne. That's the dynasty. And here's what's interesting. He told Jeroboam the same thing. He said, if you will keep my commands the way David did, I will create a dynasty for you. And it all happened just the way that God and the prophet Ahijah said that it would. Now, at Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam inherited the throne, but he also inherited a kingdom burdened by taxes and forced manual labor. Look at 1 Kings chapter 4, verse number 7. It said Solomon also had 12 district governors. Now these districts corresponded with the 12 different tribes, not including Judah. In fact, he actually made these correspond with 10 of the tribes, but because he expanded his borders, he was able to take some of the provinces or some of the districts outside of it. But the majority of them corresponded to the 10 tribes. Now let's keep reading. Solomon also had 12 district governors who were over all Israel. They were responsible for providing food for the king's household. Each of them arranged provisions for 1 month of the year. So out of these 12 districts, they had the responsibility of 1 month out of the year. They had to provide all the food for the king's palace. Not just for the king, not just for those in the palace. Actually, it extended even to all of his family and even distant relatives. And each tribe or district didn't just have to provide food for the king's palace, but they also had to perform manual labor for him. Look at 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 6, and then we're going to jump down to chapter 5, verses 13 through 18. Notice what it says. Ahishar was manager of the palace property. All of the property of Solomon, this is what he was over. Adoniram, son of Abda, was in charge of the labor force. What was the labor force? Well, now we jump down to 1 Kings chapter 5, verses 13 through 18, and we realize that King Solomon wasn't that greatly loved. Notice what it says. Then King Solomon conscripted a labor force of 30,000 men from all Israel. He sent them to Lebanon in shifts, 10,000 every month, so that each man would be 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of this labor force. Solomon also had 70,000 common laborers, 80,000 quarry workers in the hill country, and 3,600 foremen to supervise the work. Now, if you count that up and go ahead and do that, and you look at this, you have 70,000, 80,000 is 150,000, plus another 30 is 180,000, plus the 3,600, you have 183,600 men. almost what they would put for their entire army, which tells you that almost every man was working for Solomon. Now, the reason he had to conscript some men is because even though he was providing work and paying for some of these men, he still couldn't get enough. So he comes in and says, you will work for me. And notice what it says. At the king's command, it's not because they wanted to do this, at his command, they quarried large blocks of high-quality stone and shaped them to make the foundation of the temple. Men from the city of Gebal helped Solomon and Hiram's builders prepare the timber and stone for the temple. And then they continued to do this for Solomon's palace. But I want you to understand what this is saying. For 4 months out of the year, they had to be away from their homes working for Solomon. And it wasn't a choice, it was mandated. But here's what's interesting. Judah, the tribe of Judah, didn't have to provide food for the king or participate in forced manual labor. In fact, if you look closely, you'll find that Judah isn't mentioned in having to do either of those two things. Just read 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 7 through 19, and then notice what it says in verse 20. In verse 20 it says, the people of Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They were very contented with plenty to eat and drink. Well, yeah, it was all coming to the tribe of Judah. It was all coming to them. And people, that created a lot of animosity among the other tribes. Most people don't pick that up as they're reading through the Bible. But there was a lot of animosity among the other tribes because of what Solomon was doing in playing nepotism and favoritism with the tribe of Judah. That was his tribe. In fact, if you go a little bit deeper, I'm not going to go into this much, but he actually penalized the tribe of Benjamin. He made it much more harsher on the tribe of Benjamin. Does anyone know why? Because that's where Saul's family was from. He was punishing the house of Saul by punishing Benjamin. And here's what's interesting. He was the wisest man in the world, but when it came to family, and because he got away from God, he began to do these things. So when Solomon died and Rehoboam ascended to the throne, he was approached by the leaders of the northern tribes, demanding relief from the oppressive policies of his father. And when Rehoboam refused their demands, the 10 northern tribes, they revolted. And they formed their own kingdom. So you had the northern kingdom known as Israel and the southern kingdom known as Judah. Now, there was just this brief little civil war. He actually sent out a person, and they stoned him and killed him. And they sent a message back to Rehoboam, and he got ready to go fight. And God told him, don't do that. And he didn't. He was wise enough to stop and not do that. And Jeroboam became the king of Israel, ruling over the 10 northern tribes, just as the prophet Ahijah said he would. But Jeroboam didn't do what he was told to. Instead of following God's commands and the law like David did, he made 2 golden calves. And he placed one in Bethel, which was in the southern part of his kingdom. And he placed the other in Dan, which is in the northern part of his kingdom. And he encouraged his people to worship these golden calves, claiming that they were the gods that brought them out of Egypt. Look at 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 28 through 29, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Now, before you think, what in the world does this have to do with the book of Amos? If you don't understand this, you will not understand the book of Amos. All right? I'm having to teach you the historical, cultural context so you'll understand why he went there. Now, this is 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 28 through 29. Notice what it says. So on the advice of his counselors, the king made 2 gold calves. He said to the people, it is too much trouble for you to worship in Jerusalem. Look, Israel, these are the gods who brought you out of Egypt. Ooh! Now they're revising their spiritual heritage. Now they're revising history. Kind of interesting because that's what America's doing now. They want to tell us that things didn't happen the way we've always been taught. They want to tell us that we don't have a Christian nation, that it wasn't built on Christian Judeo values. No. They want to tell us it wasn't that way. Well, I want you to understand, this is the very same thing that was happening there. He builds these 2 golden calves. He says, look, Israel, these are the gods who brought you out of Egypt. He placed these calf idols in Bethel and Dan at either end of his kingdom. Now, the whole reason that Jeroboam did this was because he was afraid that if his people went to Jerusalem to worship the one true God at the temple, he would lose his kingdom. He was afraid that they would feel guilty about revolting and want the divided kingdom reunited. So he established a counterfeit religion to try and keep them from going to Jerusalem. Look at 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 26 through 27. Jeroboam thought to himself, unless I am careful, the kingdom will return to the dynasty of David. When these people go to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord, they will again give their allegiance to King Rehoboam of Judah. They will kill me and make him their king instead. Now, because he did this, God told him through the prophet Ahijah that he would cut off his family line, that all of his male descendants would be killed. So he wouldn't receive or have the dynasty that could have been his had he obeyed God and done what he was supposed to. Look at 1 Kings chapter 14, verses 7 through 10. This is the prophet Ahijah. This is the same prophet that went and found him and told him when he rent his garment in 12 different pieces and gave him 10 of them and said, you're going to become king over 10 of the tribes. This is the very same prophet. Now notice what the prophet tells him. He says, go tell Jeroboam that this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I raised you up from among the people and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I tore the kingdom away from the house of David, and I gave it to you. But you have not been like my servant David, who kept my commands and followed me with all his heart, doing only what was right in my eyes. You have done more evil than all who lived before you. You have made for yourself other gods, idols made of metal. You have aroused my anger and turned your back on me. Because of this, I'm going to bring disaster on the house of Jeroboam. I will cut off from Jeroboam every last male in Israel, slave or free. I will burn up the house of Jeroboam as one burns dung until it is all gone. Now, here's what's sad. Every king of Israel after Jeroboam continued his legacy of idolatry and committed the very same sin of encouraging their people to worship idols, these false gods. In fact, the Bible summarizes the reign of almost every king in the north with words like this. He walked in the ways of Jeroboam and his sin. You'll find that in these biblical references. Or he did not turn away from the sin of Jeroboam. And then I have the biblical references for that. Or he clung to the sin of Jeroboam. Or he considered it trivial to commit the sin of Jeroboam. Only 3 of Jeroboam's successors didn't have something like that said about them. But not because they didn't follow in Jeroboam's footsteps. Not because they weren't evil. They were very evil. But the reason they didn't have anything said like that is because they didn't reign long enough to say anything about them other than they reigned and they were evil. One reigned only a week, Zimri. One reigned only a month, Shallum. And the other 6 months, Zechariah. Not Zechariah, Zechariah. But that's why the Assyrians conquered them in 722 BC and carried them off into captivity. It's because they were evil. All of their kings, they did not have one good king. But the reason he told Jeroboam, you are more evil than anyone before you, is because they had this wonderful spiritual heritage. They had all of these wonderful laws that God had given them that would have provided their people with all of this opportunity that allowed everyone and anyone in the kingdom of God to succeed. But what he did was he revised their spiritual heritage. He made idols, and he said, these are the gods that carried you or brought you out of Egypt. And in doing that, he changed everything. And here's what's interesting. Well, I'm going to get ahead of myself, so I'm not going to do that. When we start going through the book of Amos, you're going to see that the reason they had all of these poor and needy people is because they didn't follow the law. Had they followed the law and continued to do what the Bible said, they would have taken care of all of their needy and their poor. But anyways, that's a different sermon. Now that you know all of that, let's zero in on Israel during Jeroboam II's reign, because it was during his reign that Amos prophesied. Now, Jeroboam II reigned for 41 years. And when someone reigns for that long, what does that tell you? It tells you that that was a time of stability. And so there was this wonderful time of stability, but we need to dig a little bit deeper. First of all, let me explain something about Jeroboam's name. Jeroboam II wasn't a descendant of Jeroboam I. He was just named after him. Jeroboam II was the son of Jehoash, and it was actually of the dynasty of Jehu. And let me explain why he took this name. He took this name because he felt like God had blessed the originator of this nation, and he wanted to be just like him. Now, what's interesting is his father Jehoash left him in a great position in which to rule, and let me explain why I said that. First of all, Jehoash won a major war against Judah, which made them the dominant nation. Now, he didn't start the war. In fact, he actually tried to avoid it. Look at 2 Kings chapter 14, verses 8 through 14. It says, one day Amaziah sent messengers with this challenge to Israel's king Jehoash. So Amaziah is the king of Judah. So he sent this challenge to Israel's king Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, the grandson of Jehu. So as you see this long line, Jehu starts this dynasty. Then it goes down to the son of Jehoahaz, then to Jehoash, and then finally it's going to get to Jeroboam the second. So he's the fourth in the line. But anyways, the king of Judah sends this message and he says, come and meet me in battle. But King Jehoash of Israel replied to King Amaziah of Judah with this story. Out in the Lebanon mountains, a thistle sent a message to a mighty cedar tree. Give your daughter in marriage to my son. But just then a wild animal of Lebanon came by and stepped on the thistle, crushing it. You have indeed defeated Edom, and you are very proud of it. But be content with your victory and stay at home. Why stir up trouble that will only bring disaster on you and the people of Judah? But Amaziah refused to listen, so King Jehoash of Israel mobilized his army against King Amaziah of Judah. Now let me explain something. The king, Amaziah of Judah, had gone to war with Edom and they crushed them. And he got to thinking, we're big, we're bad. I can take back the 10 northern tribes. So he sends this message to them. And when he sends this message, of course, the king of Israel tells them, you're not as big and bad as you think you are. In fact, you don't want to stir up something that you can't finish. But of course, he continues on. So then he has to come out to battle against him. So let's keep reading. It says, the two armies drew up their battle lines at Beth Shemesh in Judah. Judah was routed by the army of Israel, and its army scattered and fled for home. King Jehoash of Israel captured Judah's king, Amaziah, son of Joash and grandson of Ahaziah, at Beth Shemesh. Then he marched to Jerusalem, where he demolished 600 feet of Jerusalem's walls, from the Ephraim gate to the corner gate. He carried off all the gold and silver and all the articles from the temple of the Lord. Those were no longer sacred to Israel because they had gone off track. He also seized the treasures from the royal palace along with hostages and then returned to Samaria. So because of this war, Israel was much stronger from a military perspective than Judah. And Jeroboam II continued to maintain Israel's military strength and superiority over Judah, though he didn't lord it over them. In fact, Israel and Judah formed an alliance and worked together to overcome their common enemies. But this wasn't their fathers. Their fathers had this war, and Jeroboam II's father came out victorious, and so they had all of the strength and they were dominant over Judah. The second thing that Jehoash did that helped Jeroboam during his reign is he formed an alliance with Assyria. Or we should say that his great-grandfather Jehu, who began this dynasty, had formed an alliance with Assyria. And Jehoash strengthened the alliance by giving special tribute gifts to Shalmaneser, the Syrian king. Now the reason we know this is not because of what the Bible says. We know this because of inscriptions on the black obelisk that was discovered by archaeologists. And so we knew that there was some type of alliance between Israel and Assyria up until they finally came in and conquered them, but we didn't know why there was an alliance. But then archaeologists were digging at some ruins, and they came on this black obelisk, and here were these inscriptions that were talking about the dynasty of Jehu giving special gifts of tribute to them and had formed this alliance. So, during Jeroboam II's reign, they had peace with Assyria, and they held the upper hand with Judah. Egypt was also out of the picture because they were having trouble with the tribal kings from the lands of what is now Libya and Sudan. Syria had been defeated by the Assyrians in 796 BC, so they were in no position to attack Israel or even defend themselves from Israel. So Jeroboam II was able to expand the boundaries of his kingdom immensely. It is amazing what he did. In fact, let me just kind of go through how he expanded his borders. First, he took the Lebanon coastal plain from Syria because they were in no position to defend it. As I said, Syria had been subjugated by Assyria. The second thing that Jeroboam II did was he pushed back Moab and he secured the borders with them. Now, Moab was located in what is now modern-day Jordan. So what he did was he took back the land that had once belonged to the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. If you remember, their tribal land was on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Do you guys remember the story when they were doing the conquest of the land? Two and one half of the tribes, and the reason I say one half is because one half of Manasseh was on one side and the other side was in the western side of the Jordan River. But they actually came to Moses and they said, we love the land over here. We're shepherds. It has all of this lush grass. Can we stay here? And Moses said, you can stay here as long as you go with us to go in there, or go with Joshua, and you help the other tribes defeat the people inside, and then you can come back to these lands. They said, we'll do it. And so they did that. So their tribal land was on the east side of the Jordan River. So he took back their land, which had been lost to Moab. And last but not least, he extended the northern border of Israel all the way up to Lebo Hamath, and enlarged the southern border all the way to the Dead Sea on the east side of the Jordan River. In fact, I'm going to give you a couple of maps, or show a couple of maps that will show just how much he extended the borders of Israel. This first map shows you the borders of Israel when he ascended to the throne. Now, if you noticed, it says the days of Jehoahaz and Joash. Joash, and actually it would be Jehoash is how we would say it, would be a different one. But this Joahaz is actually called Ahaziah, and he was the king of Judah. So this is when he actually took over. If you notice, he just has that little bit. Okay, that was all of his kingdom. That was it. And then the kingdom of Judah is just down below it. So if you notice where the Sea of Galilee is, you see those two arrows that are coming down in between them, there's a little body of water. That is the Sea of Galilee. They didn't even possess land up to the Sea of Galilee. Very, very small. Now, the next map shows you how much he extended the borders of Israel during his reign. Now look at this one. If you notice, you see where it says Israel, and right above it you see that little body of water? That's the Sea of Galilee. The Jordan River runs from it all the way down to the Dead Sea. But I want you to notice they didn't even own up to the Sea of Galilee, but now they go all the way up to the Assyrian Empire. In fact, where you see Phoenicia, they actually took the majority of it. This map just doesn't show that. Judah was able to expand their borders. Philistia, do you see that? That's where the Philistines were. With the help of Jeroboam II, they were able to conquer the Philistines. And so both kingdoms actually expanded their borders, but they were actually able to come on the other side of the Jordan River. If you remember, when he first took reign or inherited the throne, they didn't even own all the way up to the Jordan River. And by the time he finished 41 years later, they extended all the way over. They pushed Moab all the way back, and Ammon, and they were able to come all the way down to the bottom of the Dead Sea. This was really the pinnacle of the Israel's kingdom, or the northern kingdom. They never had this much land. In fact, you have to go all the way back to David's time and Solomon's time to see Israel controlling that much land. So, from a military perspective, Israel felt very secure under the reign of Jeroboam II. They had the upper hand when it came to their neighbors. They had the upper hand over Judah. They had the upper hand over Moab. They had the upper hand over Syria. They had the upper hand over the Phoenicians and even the Philistines. So they were the dominant military power in that area. But at the same time, these weaker neighbors created a buffer zone from the more powerful nations that were further away. In fact, what's kind of interesting is, even though they didn't have to worry about Egypt at that time, because Egypt was having its own troubles, which allowed them to expand, or Israel to expand, but even if Egypt would have been able to take control of that, they had a buffer zone, which was Judah. And they really didn't have to worry about Assyria because they were in this alliance. But even if Assyria turned on them, the Arameans, Aram, was in between them, so it acted as a buffer zone. So they had a buffer zone of these neighbors that were between them and these more powerful nations. Israel was also as prosperous as it had ever been during the reign of Jeroboam II. You see, they had experienced peace for over 40 years because of the military dominance in the area. And because they had expanded their borders, they controlled all of the major trade routes. Now, here's what's interesting. When you study Israel and you see how small it is, it's smaller than the state of New Jersey. fact, you can actually drive from the top of it to the bottom of it in about 8 hours if you're going pretty fast. Didn't have to make all the stops. It's really not very big. And here's what's interesting. It controls so much, and it's such a strategic place on this earth. In fact, all the way back in the history of time, Israel has always been at the crossroads. If you remember when Paul was defending Christianity, and he told one of the kings, he said, this was not done in a secret corner of the empire. And when he said that, what he meant was, Israel was always the place that every nation wanted. And the reason it was is because it was the crossroads to every continent. It was the crossroads from Europe into Asia. It was the crossroads from Asia into Africa. And then also, if you want to go into the Arab nations. But it was always in the place where everything crisscrossed. So if you held that land, then you held the key to all the trade routes. Now, what's interesting is when they expanded their borders and they had this military strength and this dominance, what it meant was they actually controlled all of the major trade routes, which opened up new markets in every direction. To the north, they controlled the trade routes to the Lebanon coastal area to what is now modern Turkey, and also through Syria up to the Assyrian kingdom. So they had trade going up north. To the west, they were able to trade with the other nations through shipping on the Mediterranean Sea. They could go to places like Italy. Though it's not brought up in the Bible, they could go to all of these places by sailing on the Mediterranean Sea. To the south, they had control of the trade routes through Moab and onto the spice route in Arabia. You see, a lot of the spices came through India and through what we would consider to be Eastern Africa. And as a result of that, it would come all the way up through Arabia, but it would have to go through Israel. They controlled the trade routes through Judah to Egypt and into Africa. And to the east, they controlled the trade routes through Ammon and Aram to Mesopotamia. So their economy took off during this 40 to 50 year period. And it created a growing wealthy upper class with summer and winter homes and all types of luxuries. People, this was the golden age of Israel during the divided kingdom age. It had never been as strong militarily. It had never been so prosperous. If you would have gone there, you would have thought this is much like what America is today. We have buffer zones between us and the other powerful nations. What are those buffer zones? The Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. We're stronger than Canada. We're stronger than Mexico. They're not really a threat. So we tend to think of ourselves as being very secure. That's how they felt. We really have the key to all the technology. As a result of that, everything has to cross through America. Everyone really wants to do business with America because regardless of what people say about our school systems, we have the greatest minds. Technology flourishes under capitalism. And because we have a capitalist economy, you're always going to see the best and the greatest ideas come through America. When that stops, it will stop for us. But I want you to understand, just as we feel like in America, we live in the most blessed nation, and we're very secure, and things are always going to be good, that's the way they felt. Truly, it was the best of times and the worst of times. It was the best of times militarily and economically, and it was the worst of times spiritually, because they had forgotten their true spiritual heritage and they had turned to idolatry. In fact, they had rewritten their spiritual heritage. They looked at these golden calves and said, these are the gods that brought us out of Egypt. And as a result of revising that, they no longer kept the laws. And that's going to have dire consequences to the people. They also had become very immoral. Look at Amos chapter 2, verse 7. I'll show you what I'm talking about. This is just one example how immoral they had become. It says, they trample helpless people in the dust and shove the oppressed out of the way. Both father and son sleep with the same woman, corrupting my holy name. Now that's strictly prohibited in the law, but that became very common. This wasn't a one-time occurrence, but they became so sexually promiscuous because of mixing or trying to mix the religion of Yahweh, the Israelite religion, with all of the pagan religions, that they became very, very immoral. And this is how it was. So from their perspective, it was the best of times, but from God's perspective, it was the worst of times. And that's the historical, cultural context of the book. So now we have this narrative in which to place the prophecies of Amos. Now all of a sudden we know what was happening at this time. They had enlarged their borders. They were the strongest, most dominant nation militarily. They were the most prosperous economically. They thought that they were indestructible. They thought that prosperity was going to continue to go on. And they thought that God was blessing them because they had this spiritual heritage. And everyone called themselves what? An Israelite. Going back to their spiritual heritage, just like everyone in Christian, or the majority, call themselves Christians, even they don't know what that means today in America. So now you understand the history, you understand the culture, you understand the situation that prompted God to send Amos. So as we go through this book, his prophecies are going to make a lot of sense, as well as his message to the citizens of Israel. Because they think everything is hunky-dory. And what they don't know is God's judgment is going to come upon them because of what they've done and what they've allowed. And this is a very relevant book to what's happening in America today.
There's a chair that's never moved, a cup that still remembers you. Sunlight spills across the floor, just like it did before. I kept your books upon the shelf, didn't change a thing myself. Every creak inside this home whispers softly, you're not alone. There's dust on dreams, but they still shine. I've been waiting. Take your time. The porch lights burning through the rain. I'll be here when you come home again. When you come home again, the world can rest its fight. Lay down your heavy heart. You've carried far too tight. No need for words to explain. I'll hold you when you come home again. The map of years is on your face. Every scar's a line of grace. You walked the miles I dreamed you would. Now come back home, it's understood. I'll cook the stew you used to crave. We'll laugh at all the time we saved. The kettle hums a sweet refrain of a love that never washed away. You don't owe you speak, and shadows I reply, and light our echoes drift through